Returning to Theodore Arult Dodge's Alexander. Chapter 6, Armies in the 5th century BC. The Persian army was divided into active and garrison troops. The whole population was parceled out on a decimal basis, and from this the army was drawn. The bodyguard of the king, the Immortals, was 10,000 strong. The satraps gradually acquired more and more power, grew careless of war, and lived in their harems. Mercenary troops were engaged, many from Greece. Cavalry was the most effective of the Persian arms. The foot was numerous but unreliable. Chariots remained in use. Wide open plains were chosen as battlefields. Tactics underwent no improvement. The Persians were sliding backward in war. In Greece, mercenary troops also appeared, and though citizens were still held to service, substitutes were allowed. The best Greek soldiers became professionals and sold their services abroad to whomsoever paid the most, despite which there was always a kernel left of good native troops. Such was the Theban sacred band. The lance of the hoplite grew in length. A new body of light troops, peltasts, was created, much better than the irregular Saloi. The cavalry grew in numbers, but was still far from good. The phalanx was improved in drill and battle tactics. It was a body perfect for one blow on level ground or for defense, but was easily disorganized by rough ground, and if broken, it was gone. Greek armies were small and carried little baggage. They marched far and stood hardship and rough usage with wonderful constancy. There were several orders of battle, but the parallel was still generally employed. Troops were now paid. After the Peloponnesian War, discipline declined. There continued to be much religious ceremonial connected with the movements of armies, and the burial of the dead was demanded by custom. The Greeks were barbarous to prisoners. There was no field fortification, but cities were well fortified. These were usually taken by storm or stratagem. Rams and other siege machinery gradually came into use, with mines, mounds, towers, etc. War on land and war at sea were not so different as they are today. The hoplites served on the fleet as readily as on land. Ships were small and put into shore every night. The numerous rowers left small room for soldiers aboard. Warships sought to ram their opponents and then to board them. Naval tactics was simple. In Sparta, Laconians, freedmen, helots, and mercenaries crept into the army. In Athens, the list of citizens freed from personal service grew large. The people allowed a small scope to the strategoi. They were under a civil officer's control, to the great loss of ability to act. Cavalry began to improve somewhat in numbers and effectiveness. Athens looked at war more intelligently than Sparta. The latter never saw beyond its material side. And here the author has drawn his depiction of Persian bodyguards. Persians. The Persian kingdom, founded by Cyrus, first received a regular military organization from Darius, son of Hystaspes. Um, 521 to 485 BC. That's Hystaspes. Hystaspes. This monarch divided his territory into 20 satrapies, confided to each satrap only the civil power, while himself appointed and controlled the commander of the military forces. These troops were fed from the tax collected in each satrapy. There were active and garrison troops. The former were divided into bodies of 1,000 men each and did duty on the borders and along the great highways which traversed the kingdom. They were rigidly inspected, and a grand review of them held each year. The whole kingdom was divided into military districts, with central assembling points in each. The garrison troops were kept under separate control for the protection of the city fortresses, and were not obliged to assemble for the annual inspection. Their organization was quite apart from the active army, though resembling it in minor detail. Several corps, each 10,000 strong, served at court. The most noble and brave of the Persians served in the corps d'élite, which was kept always at 10,000 men, and was known as the Immortals. These held the first place of honor in the army. The second belonged to a somewhat similar corps of Medes, or Medes. The satraps and great officials each had his own bodyguard, which he regulated himself. The whole population, like the Jews, was divided into tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s, and in case of war, fresh corps of reinforcements could be raised quickly and effectively. These levies, when made, were apt to be commanded by the large landowners of the districts were raised, thus preserving the national character of the force. Sometimes, as in Darius's expedition against the Scythians, or Xerxes against Greece, a general draft of the entire people was made, and the king determined how much each province should furnish in men, material, horses, ships, and so forth. Herodotus gives an extended and interesting description of the 56 tribes and peoples represented under Xerxes, and reviewed by him in Thrace at the time of his invasion of Greece. The troops were not paid. During active service, they were fed by simply seizing and gathering in supplies wherever found. Provinces through which a Persian army passed were eaten up as by a plague of grasshoppers. Rank and command were well settled. The chiliarchs, or colonels, who commanded 1,000 men, and the mariarchs, or division generals, who commanded 10,000, were held in honor. The higher commands were filled by the relatives and favorites of the king. Though the Persians became a luxurious people and lost much of their warlike quality, they were in early days simple, soldierly, and brave. They received an excellent training for war. It was only cohesion which the Persian army lacked. But after the days of Xerxes I, 465 BC, they began to fall backwards. The great nobles lived in their harems, and more rarely assumed command in person. Mercenary troops were gradually introduced, and to the best of these the safety of the kingdom was confided. This labor-saving system grew fast when it was found easy to raise mercenaries. And here, again, the author offers his depiction of a Persian officer in another contour drawing. You see that? The Greek phalangites that may be pronounced phalangites, Phalangites. We'll go with that. The Greek phalangites received pay at the rate of 1 dericus, or a ducat in brackets, per head per month, between $4 and $5, in addition to which sum it is probable they received an equal amount for rations. A great source of weakness of the central military power arose when the satraps became more independent and gradually got possession of the armed as well as the civil control of their satrapies. It was not long thereafter before these satraps became practically independent monarchs, assuming all the power and most of the attributes which properly belonged to the sovereign, and yielding but a nominal fealty. But the great king retained the power of assembling the army. Thus, at the time of the Greco-Persian Wars, the bulk of the Persian forces was by the king's orders concentrated in Thrace, Asia Minor, and Egypt. The most effective part of the Asiatic armies was cavalry. In this, the Orientals have always excelled. The horse was in the East then, as now, the constant companion of man, and cavalry was the natural arm. The best heavy cavalry was the Persian, then followed the Median, and of Asia Minor, the Parthian. The nomad tribes furnished an excellent light cavalry, much like the Cossacks of today. The foot was more numerous but less good. The light troops, slingers, darters, and archers were abundant but had little discipline. The Greek mercenaries furnished the stanchest of the heavy troops. There were as high as 50,000 in the Persian service at the time. Bodies of native troops were organized in like fashion. Some of the Persians were accoutred in the most splendid manner, wore scaled armor, and carried weapons of the finest description. Chariots, plain and scythed, were in vogue, and camels bearing archers and darters were not uncommon. There had been no progress in tactics since the elder Cyrus' organization and discipline in the field were wretched. On the march there was no order. The army camped near water and pasturage, and surrounded the camps with wagons, stockades, and earthworks, sometimes using their shields as a capping to the latter. The higher generals had tents. The commonalty slept in huts in permanent camps, or without shelter in daily camps. In battle, the Persians, relying on their bravery, preferred to advance straight on the enemy, without resort to stratagem or tactical maneuvers. Wide-open plains were their usual choice for battlefields, on which their numbers, and especially the cavalry and chariots, could act to the best advantage. They formed in a long line, so as to lap the enemy's flanks, the cavalry on the wings, the chariots in front. The center was the place of honor. Here the king took his stand, surrounded by his bodyguard. On either side were placed the chosen troops in great squares, always 30, often 100 deep, with light troops stationed all about them and in the intervals. The king gave the war cry for the day, and at a signal the whole mass moved forward. The Persian army was full of gallant men. It had for generations been a terror to the Greeks, who feared to face it. but it was unwieldy from too vast a bulk and from lack of homogeneity and discipline, and was subject to speedy and unreasoning panics. After a defeat, a Persian army was bound to lose heavily from lack of ability to rally for defense, and would often disperse so as absolutely to vanish. Destined to act in the plain, the chariots and horsemen and the huge squares were utterly unsuited to hilly countries, and were sure to fall into disorder when subjected to unusual tests. Regular sieges were unknown. Cities were captured by ruse, treachery, or on rare occasions by storm. Sieges were still apt to be very long drawn out. In campaigns against barbarians, the Persians' method accomplished good results. But their mountain tribes always gave them much trouble, and the civilized discipline of the Greeks they could by no means withstand. In declaring war, the Persian habit was to demand, through heralds, earth and water as a token of submission. Greeks. Down to the Battle of Plataea, 479 BC, there was small change in the organization of the Greeks. From that time on, many alterations came gradually about. A number of slaves appeared in the ranks. The first instance of a standing army was the occasion when the Greek cities during the Persian wars mutually agreed to keep under arms 10,000 foot, 1,000 horse, and 100 warships. Wars beyond the borders of Greece called for larger forces than had been necessary, and in addition to the citizen's soldier, who had so far been the glory as well as guardian of Greece, large forces of freedmen, slaves, and particularly mercenary troops were created. In the Peloponnesian War, and during the period of her greatest splendor, 465 to 429 BC, Athens made use extensively of mercenary troops, and other Greek states soon followed suit. Down to the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians had retained their civil and military virtues in full force, but this internecine struggle ruined the population, devastated Greece, and familiarized the Greeks with serving for gold. Pericles found it necessary to pay the troops. The hoplites had nothing left to subsist upon. They had already served for pay in Asia on a limited scale, but after the Peloponnesian War, the Oriental princes or satraps, Carthage, or indeed any other people or prince who needed them, had no difficulty in collecting large bodies of Greek mercenaries. From this paid foreign service, it was but a step to the point where the Greeks were willing to serve in preference him who paid the most. The pay varied from 5 to 20 cents a day. The best of the Greek population embraced arms as a profession, engaged mostly abroad, and left the poorer material at home. Greek cities themselves had to hire soldiers. Just as a personal footnote, reminding that when they're saying the pay varied from 5 to 20 cents a day, I imagine Dodge is talking about American conversion of that money, right? To give you perspective, but also to remind you of the full perspective that he's writing at a time before the turn of the century, in the 1800s. And a personal footnote. The better citizens would no longer serve. They procured substitutes, and the armies, often kept standing, were filled up with wretched stuff. But in most of the Greek cities there remained a better nucleus, a corps d'élite, in which alone the highest citizens had a place. Though this was small, it was a leaven. Such was the Theban sacred band, or band of lovers, which was bound together by ties of affection and oaths of fidelity, and but 300 strong so often saved the day for Thebes. This gallant body was finally cut to pieces at Cheronea. It would not yield a foot. Every man fell where he stood, sword in hand. While the armies of Greece were thus degenerating, the schools in which, in addition to gymnastics, were taught mathematics and the art of war, as then understood, continued to grow in excellence. There was never a lack of well-trained leaders. It was the freeborn rank and file which was degenerating, or allowing hirelings to do the duty it should do itself. The bone and sinew of the Greek republics had disappeared. The hoplites continued to be the favorite troops. Only they were looked on as warriors. Their armament remained the same, except that their shields grew smaller, from 4 to 2.5 feet in height, while the pike grew longer, from 10 to as much as 21 feet, or as some state 24 feet, which was the sarissa of Macedon. Here the author drew a picture of a full-armed Greek archer. And also a peltast. The Siloi served to protect the hoplites as well as to open the battle. The best archers and slingers came from Crete, Rhodes, or Canania. That would be Acarnania, Aegina, and Achaia. The Siloi came from a poor class, as of yore, were illy armed and of little consideration. It was reserved for Hippocrates of Athens to better their discipline and condition and prove their utility in service. After the Peloponnesian War, he created a new body armed with well-poised spears for casting, light but good linen armor, and a small round shield, pelti, from which they were called peltasts, as shown in the last illustration. These troops had in a degree the lightness of the Siloi and the steadfastness of the hoplites. This new arm proved useful and was shortly initiated by the other Greek cities. That would be this new proved useful and was shortly imitated by the other Greek cities. Scarlet or crimson were the favorite colors of the warrior. The Greek cavalry was either heavy, cataphracti, bearing long, double-ended lances, sword and axe, small shield, and fully armored, as was also the horse, or light acroballisti, far-shooters, who were merely light-armored riders, and like nomads in their methods. The force of cavalry had been somewhat increased by the time of the Persian invasion to about 1/10 the foot. Cataphractos, illustrated by the author. Agesilaus, in Asia Minor, made it for a time 1/4 the foot. But the Greek cavalry was essentially poor, though certain leaders like Epaminondas managed to get good work out of it. The Greeks were not a nation of horsemen. The relative numbers of heavy and light foot and cavalry were very various. At Marathon, Herodotus, were 10,000 hoplites, a few, Siloi, no cavalry. At Plataea, served 38,700 heavy, 71,300 lightfoot, and no cavalry. At the opening of the Peloponnesian War, Athens had Thucydides, in brackets, 13,000 heavy, 1,600 lightfoot, and 1,200 horse, not counting 16,000 hoplites to defend the city. Oh, and by the way, the other quote where it says, at Marathon were 10,000 hoplites, a few, Siloi, no cavalry. At Plataea served 38,700 heavy, 71,300 lightfoot, and no cavalry. That was a quote by Herodotus. Epaminondas had at Leuctra Diodorus, in brackets is the quote, 6,000 heavy foot, 1,500 light foot, 500 horse. At Mantinea, 30,000 heavy and light, and 3,000 horse. Here's the author's depiction of weapons, continuing with his method of contour drawings, as well as his pictures of headgear, various headgear. The phalanx had proven so good. The title would be Depth of Phalanx. The last section we covered was Relative Strength of Heavy and Light Foot. That was the title. And the title of this is Depth of Phalanx. The way these titles are arranged on the page, there is nothing in the border at the top of the page, so a lot of these titles just appear at the top, and the reader's eye might glance by them. At least that's the case with me, so forgive me if I re-mention the name of the titles before reading on. Continue. Depth of Phalanx. The phalanx had proven so good a formation during the Persian Wars that the Greeks sought to improve rather than to change it. The Peloponnesian War furnished the opportunity to do this, and the Greeks had by nature exceptional capacity as drill masters and organizers. The unit was no longer decimal, but founded on the powers of the number 2. The depth of the phalanx was rarely less than 8 or more than 16 men, though it was on rare occasions made so light as 4 or so heavy as 24. Epaminondas made a column 48 men deep at Leuctra and Mantinea. But this was not the phalanx proper. Generally, the 8, 12, or 16 deep file was in use. Xenophon puts the average at 12. By employing any given number of files under a leader, any convenient unit of organization could be made, or detachment formed. The leader stood in front, and there were a number of file closers to keep order in the ranks. Formation of the phalanx. Larger divisions of the phalanx had their ensigns and trumpeters, and each leader had near him 1 or 2 men to convey or repeat his orders. The right flank of the phalanx was called the head, the left the tail, for the phalanx usually marched by the right, and on the right the commander of the phalanx had his station. Small intervals were left between the divisions to allow the light troops to pass through to front or rear. There were many tactical formations of the phalanx for a battle known to the Greeks, such as a refusal of the right or left wing, and various forms of columns and wedges. Columns of attack were of later origin. Maneuvers were made in measured step to the sound of fifes. And here we have some pictures of the swords and a holding shield. There's the swords there, and the shield that follows. The cadenced step was essential to preserve order in a phalanx with 12-foot pikes. The pike was practically the only weapon used so long as the phalanx held together. The foremost ranks protended their pikes. The rear ranks leaned them forward on the shoulders of their leaders to break the flight of arrows, or held them erect. The soiloi, peltast, and horse were set up and employed in many fashions. The soiloi never came to close quarters. The peltast often did so. The cavalry did not improve much, but the Greeks recognized the uselessness of too great a depth, such as the Spartans had had, and the horse was formed in aisles of files 4 deep and of a convenient length of rank. If the aisles were occasionally formed deeper, only the first 4 ranks attacked. The balance remained for the moment in reverse. New title: Position of the Various Arms. The intervals between aisles were greatly than those in the phalanx. Some of the Thracian and Thessalonian and other semi-nomad horse was wont to form in wedge and rhomboid or lozenge columns for a charge. Here's a diagram of the Thessalonian lozenge. Don't know if you can make that out there. There's not really much, there's just small dots. Anyway. The phalanx, as for the nucleus, occupied the center. The light troops might be on the flanks in front, in the intervals in the rear, according as the demand was for protection to front or flanks, or for shooting missiles over the heads of the phalanx. Small bodies of soiloi often accompanied the cavalry. They were so active as to be able to follow its evolutions. Their general duties were to cover the phalanx and patrol the camp, seize heights, tear down obstacles, open the battle, follow the beaten enemy with the horse, or cover a retreat. The peltast in battle were generally on the flanks. The horse was on one or both flanks. The acroballisti skirmished. The cata fracti were held back for a final effort. The advantages of the phalanx lay in its cohesion and weight. It was difficult to withstand its impact when the blow was delivered from a short distance and on level ground, or under such circumstances that the formation could remain intact. To break through it by an attack was practically impossible. Only its flanks and rear were weak. But if the phalanx was on rough or uneven ground, or had to march over a distance to the assault, gaps were apt to be rent in the mass, and into these a skillful enemy could pour and destroy the body. There was but one line. The phalanx had no reserve to re-establish a failing battle. Neither the rear ranks of the hoplites could perform this duty, for they were fatigued by the march and battle, and if demoralization supervened, they all the more partook it, nor could the Siloi, as they were not staunch enough nor armed with hand-to-hand weapons. Though the peltast might have been so employed, it never seemed to occur to the Greeks to put them to such a use. A reserve was the conception of an individual, not a principle of tactics with them. Thus the value of the phalanx lay in the defensive or in an offensive blow given from a short distance and always in close order. And right, the title of this section is Order of March, right? The Greek wars, like the phalanx, generally partook of a defensive character, or rather, from the defensive character of Greek wars very naturally arose the phalangeal idea. The Greek armies were usually small, their baggage train limited. Their marches were, as a rule, in one column, by the right of the order of battle. Thus the head of the column consisted of Siloi, which also acted as flankers. Then came the cavalry and the peltast of the right wing, then the phalanx. Behind this was apt to be placed the train of wagons and pack animals, and then came the peltast and cavalry of the left wing, then again Siloi. Hampered with little trains and small in number, the armies of the Greeks could and did often perform wonderful marches, and sometimes at once went into battle. 15 miles was the average march, but the Spartans marched to Marathon, 150 miles in 3 days, and arrived ready for immediate action, but too late. The theory of marches was not as generally understood and practiced as the theory of fighting. Marches were often carelessly conducted, but some of the Greek generals marched their armies with consummate intelligence. There were no such set rules for the route as for the battlefield. The Greek orders of battle were: number 1, the parallel. In this the lines marched against each other, front to front, aiming to strike, all along the line, at the same moment. Of course, this section is titled Orders of Battle. The advantage of this was an equal strength at every point. Its weakness, that it was liable to be broken in some place by valor or numbers, or by the occurrence of gaps, or that the shorter line could be outflanked by the longer. Number 2, the parallel, with one or other or both wings reinforced. The wing strengthened by a line or column in its front, made direct or obliquely for the enemy, and the rest of the line less advanced. Then the troops reinforced the wing, was covered by light troops. The object was either to crush or surround the enemy's wing, or drive it in upon the center so as to take advantage of the resulting confusion. Sometimes both wings were reinforced and the center withheld in similar manner. The other methods of strengthening one or both wings were employed. The weakness of this formation was the possible sundering of wings and center, which would then lie open to being beaten in detail. Before we go to number 3, I'll just show you the diagrams where they're showing parallel order wing reinforced, or parallel order, oblique order. These are the 3 formations. Boy, here we go. Yeah, right. And there's one down here as well. There we go. Yeah, not sure how well you can make those out. They're simply lines and the typical square patterns to indicate the armies, or to indicate the groups. Right, moving along. Number 3, the oblique. This, in its simple form, was a mere variation from the parallel order due to accidents of ground or tactical difficulties. In its best form, it was the invention of the epam enodas. Oh, and by the way, folks, the images, the three formations that I just showed you, were in this particular order. The first one was parallel order, wing reinforced. The second one was parallel order, right? Just simple parallel order. And the third was oblique order, where it fans out at a different angle, right? Where are we? One wing was materially strengthened and fell first on the enemy's wing opposite, in front, or flank. The other wing was refused, or in brackets, held back, or advanced more slowly, and from the nature of things in a sort of echeloned order, and thus the line became oblique. As used by Apam Enondas, this was the greatest advance in battle tactics ever made at one step. The advantage of this order was that the strengthened wing was sure to crush the enemy's flank, and while the whole enemy army would partake of its demoralization, the center and other wing which had been refused would remain in good condition for a further blow or for pursuit. It is perhaps the order which has in all ages proved the most effective. It will be described more fully in the Battle of Leuctra. All other orders were mere variations of these, and up to Epem Enondas Day, the parallel was practically the only one used. There was much perfection of detail, but tactically originality was absent. Rank and command remained the same as at an earlier period. The Thebans had from 4 to 11 leaders, boeotarchs, who, well, that is spelled Boeotarchs. Boeotarchs, who commanded in rotation, and all laid down their office with the year. As already noted, until Plataea, the Greek troops served without remuneration. The Athenians first began to pay the troops. The amount varied. It averaged 10 drachmas, or in brackets, $2, again, reminding you, he's writing from 1800s, per month for a foot soldier. The cavalry received 2, 3, and 4 times as much, according to its grading. The officers were paid twice to 5 times as much as the men. Thucydides says the soldier received as much for rations as for pay. Pay ceased with war, but the horseman received something for forage during peace, being held to keep his mount available on call. The troops lived on the country they traversed. With small armies, this was no great hardship within the national territory. Victual for several days was not infrequently carried in the baggage train, or brought by sea to given points when practicable armies hugged the sea to have the support of their fleet. Rations in bulk were sometimes contracted for by the state for delivery at times and places stated. At their best, the Greeks stood hardship perhaps better than any men have ever done. What other has ever marched so far as Alexander's tireless soldier? What retreat can compare to that of the 10,000? Caesar's legions came closest to them. In one quality alone is the modern soldier their equal or superior. The soldier of the last 200 years has been called on to stand greater dissemination on the battlefield, and has cheerfully stood it. But in the other qualifications of the soldier, especially the ability to march far and fast on slender rations, the Greek is incomparable. Discipline varied much at different times, and with different nations being naturally a reflection of the character of the people or of the leaders. Down to the Peloponnesian War, discipline and the feeling of honor among the troops was markedly good in almost all Greek states. Military faults were severely punished, grave ones by death, or what to the Greeks was worse, open branding with dishonor. Rewards were equally pronounced. The commonest citizen might rise to distinction by a single act of bravery. Again, the commonest citizen might rise to distinction by a single. One more time. The commonest citizen might rise to distinction by a signal act of bravery. Oh, I see. I'm getting tripped up here because I'm thinking he intended the word to be single, right? The commonest citizen might rise to distinction by a single act of bravery, but it is in fact printed here signal. Perhaps that's what he intended. I'm not sure. But yeah, I kept tripping over that and didn't know why. Anyway, the leader who won a victory became the worshipped hero of the people, but great rewards were jealously given. Miltiades was not awarded the crown of laurel because he had not won alone. The army must have the first reward, the general the next. Booty was largely distributed to both, and booty included prisoners of war who were ransomed at high prices or sold into slavery. There's a picture of a depiction of a victorious Greek. Okay. All right. The victorious Greek. Okay. The place of victory was marked by trophies, or piles of weapons, or weapons hung on masts, and by columns with inscriptions reciting the event. Sometimes all Greece would join in recognizing the services of some state, as in the case of Athens after Marathon, or of Plataea after the battle of that name. And the title at the top of the page is Ceremonies Preceding Battle. But after the Peloponnesian War, the better instincts of the Greeks appear to have been lost, and their military spirit slackened. Disorder and mutinies were not infrequent. Leaders were compelled to purchase the good conduct of the troops by largesses. Awful punishments for base or scandalous actions grew in frequency. This showed a slackening in the soldierly bearing. Civil war, not infrequently, results thus. And here's a illustration of a trophy. See that there? The herald was an universally known and respected official among all the ancients. War was declared by a formal accusation of and demand for reparation for certain acts by a herald. On refusal, a bloody lance and a firebrand were cast by him upon the enemy's soil as a declaration of war, and a threat of revenge by fire and sword. Before war or battle, many of the tedious ceremonials and vows to the gods were universal. The priest and augurs divined from the sacrificial entrails. The practical application of these proceedings lay in the hold it gave the leader on the superstitious feelings of his army. If the victims were pronounced favorable, enthusiasm rose. The warriors took a light meal, and then, to the singing of the paean and the playing of the flutes, marched to battle. A battle cry, as the phalanx closed with the enemy, was common. At certain periods the phalanx marched to battle in silence, so as the more distinctly to hear the orders, and chanted the paean when near the enemy, clashing their lances upon their shields and raising the battle cry when they closed in upon him. The Greeks were a talkative, almost a garrulous people, but under discipline they could be singularly quiet. As fighters, they were quiet and determined. New title, top of the page, Camps and Fortifications. Religion demanded the burial of those slain in battle. For this purpose the truce was usual after victory. The fear of the anger of the gods for refusal of this right often forestalled the grasping of the fruits of victory. It was the victors who erected their trophies and buried their dead. The vanquished were compelled to sue for the right of burial. Such a request was of itself an acknowledgment of defeat. The bodies or ashes of fallen warriors were sent to their homes, and were there received with solemn ceremonial and given due sepulture. The Greeks were utterly barbarous in many things. As a rule, among the captives, the men were slain, and the women and children sold into slavery. Not infrequently, these last also were killed, or even burned in numbers at a time. Enemies might be annihilated, tortured, or used in the most inhuman or indecorous manner, without the suspension that such an act was reprehensible. The Greeks did not usually fortify their camps, but relied on situation for defense. The troops were often sheltered in tents, made of hides and carried by the men. The Greek soldiers always carried a large blanket wrap for protection from the weather. Now here's a picture of the use of a cloak as a shield. It was drawn from a vase. All right. This was capable, as the cloak has been in all ages, of being used on occasion for defense. The field fortifications of the Greeks, or fortified lines for the protection of given places, or to protect the access from harbor to town, as of the Piraeus to Athens, in brackets, were constructed of earthen walls with ditch, palisades, or hurdle-work, albatus, or sometimes stone. New title, top of the page, Siege Operations. Right? Now, these titles that I mentioned, they're not broken up into an orderly representation of the text themselves. Like, these are not structured sections. It's simply, these are like those biblical notes. Sometimes you'll find in various Bibles where they'll put like a really brief few lines to describe what you're going to read in the section. They're not, separate titles themselves, sort of thing, if that makes sense. The Spartans in 429 BC surrounded Plataea with a double wall of intricate construction and great strength, which will be described elsewhere. But works were rarely so elaborate. The Greek cities were generally provided with thick and high stone walls, the idea of which they borrowed from the East. On these walls, at the angles or at arrow-shot distance, stood stone towers. Along the top of the wall ran a road protected outwardly by overhanging battlements, so castellated and perforated that the foot of the fortifications and the surrounding country could be reached by missiles. A wide and deep dry or wet moat lay outside. Inside were one or more citadels in the places most capable of defense, and similarly, but more stoutly fortified. In Athens, such was the Acropolis. In Thebes, the Cadmea. Now, here's a diagram of mantelets. All right. The Greeks took fortified cities by ruse whenever possible. If storm was resorted to, the light troops drove the defenders from the walls with their missiles, while picked heavy troops mounted the walls by ladders or on the upraised and interlocked shields of the rest. This was called a testudo, or a tortoise, or broke into the gates. They blockaded cities by walls of contravallation around and facing the town, sometimes by additional walls of circumvallation built outside and at a suitable distance from the first and facing away from the town to hold an army of relief in check. And the title at the top of this page, Siege Devices, right? In regular sieges, they first established camps at appropriate intervals and joined them with works, then cleared the walls of their defenders with catapults or ballistas, built covered ways towards the wall, threw up huge sloping mounds to command it, filled the ditch, which they approached under cover of movable screens and sheds, and undermined the wall or broke it down with rams. A breach made, it was stormed. But catapults and ballistas were apparently not known until the Peloponnesian War. The catapult, or cannon of the ancients, was a species of huge bow capable of throwing pikes weighing from 10 to 300 pounds over half a mile. The ballista, or mortar, threw heavy stones, or flights of arrows, or other substances with accurate aim to a considerable distance. Here's a picture of one of those small hand rams, as opposed to like a big battering ram. These ones are something a few men would hold and use there. I've never seen that before. That's interesting. Well, I've seen it modern day in police shows, that sort of thing, but I don't remember hearing it mentioned in my studies of the ancients. Anyway, very good. Rams were at first mere pointed beams, handled by men. They were later swung in heavy framework. Here we go. They were later swung in heavy framework and hung on ropes or chains. They were generally placed in covered buildings mounted on wheels, which were then slowly pushed up against the walls by men with levers. Mines were commonly opened from a distance and dug to a point under the walls and were there sustained by wooden piles. The chambers were filled with combustibles, and being set on fire, they baked, crumbled, and dropped the earth and thus the heavy wall above it. Cool. Movable towers of several stories set on wheels came into use as an easier means of overriding the walls than mounds. And the title above, this one on this page, is Devices for Defense. They were built at a distance beyond range of missiles and rolled up by men. The lower story often held the ram. The besieged used converse means of defense. They constructed wood shields against the besiegers' fire, threw down the ladders of the storming parties, poured hot water or boiling oil or pitch upon them, and rolled heavy stones from the walls. They made sorties to destroy the besiegers' works, to reestablish communications with the outside world, or to cut their way out. Here they show the writer draws up a diagram of a breach in the wall. See that? They raised the walls, built curtains or half-moons inside a breach, as shown. Countermined to destroy the enemy's mines, and set his works on fire by arrows tipped with tarred tow, or by fire pots cast by the catapults, or by other similar means. Sieges were very laborious. The defense was apt to be desperate, for the capture of the city resulted in the slaying or selling into slavery of all the inhabitants. Terms were rarely made, or if made, were often violated. Sieges were therefore long in duration and cost enormously in men and treasure. Good faith in ancient war was not universal. A pledge was by no means sacred. Heralds alone were inviolate, and not always they. And a subheading here, fleets. War at sea and war on land were much less different in olden times than today. All Greek soldiers were more or less sailors. All generals were equally admirals. New title at the top of the page, Naval Warfare. In the heroic days, fleets were used merely for piracy. As commerce grew, piracy decreased. The best period of the Greek marine was from the Persian Wars to Alexander's day. Themistocles, or that would be Themistocles, was the founder of the Athenian navy. Until the fall of Syracuse, Athens was preeminent at sea. The Greek fleets always played a great part in war. The irregular and rocky coast, as well as the sharp and sudden storms of Greece, necessitated the use of small craft. Ships of war were propelled by oars, using sails only as an auxiliary means. They were long and shoal, with 1, 2, or 3, and more banks of oars. There was but small space except for rowers and soldiers. They could carry little victual and water, and had to be accompanied by transports or else keep close to shore. They landed, as a rule, every night, and the troops disembarked and camped. During storms, the ships ran great danger of shipwreck, or the fleets of dispersion. Transports and merchantmen used sails more than oars, and were in shape very much like tubs. They were called round, as men of war were denominated long ships. Each term was descriptive of the craft. As the best citizens preferred service as hoplites or horsemen, only the lower classes, freedmen or slaves, were left for the fleet. But in times of danger, much of the infantry served aboard the vessels. The duties were simple, and could be easily learned. The triremes had from 150 rowers upwards, and carried 40 to 50 and more hoplites. Sea fights were apt to occur near shore. Fleets were mobile and could readily maneuver. In order of battle, they kept as close together as ease of rowing would permit. The great effort was to ram the enemy's vessels amidships, for which purpose each Greek trireme had an iron prow. Or, if its rudder could be broken, a vessel was at the mercy of the adversary. Boarding was the common resort, in which both warriors and oarsmen took a hand. The methods at sea and on land were much the same. Fleets and armies were wont to sustain each other, even to the extent of using their men and artillery in common, i.e., the fleet would come close inshore, disembark its quota, and take part in the action. In sieges of cities on the seaboard, which were common, both worked together. Incidentally, the title at the top of this page, Decay of Spartan Army. In subheading, Sparta. Sparta's system remained substantially the same from the time of Lycurgus down to the Peloponnesian War, but rivalry with Athens and the necessity of possessing a fleet, if Sparta could arrest her competitors' preponderance in Greece, changed the habits of centuries. Money became essential to conduct war against wealthy Athens, and money brought into Sparta those things which soon drove out the ancient national simplicity. And this all the more speedily from its novelty. The armies now no longer contained citizens alone, though these were still the kernel, but the Laconians, freedmen, helots, and mercenary troops composed a large part of it. The free population was divided into 5 classes from which the ephors called into service in war as many as were needed according to age. Cleombrotus at Leuctra had in the ranks the citizens from 20 to 35. After Leuctra, those up to 40 were called in. The number of freedmen who gradually crept into service was large. Agesilaus had 3,000 in Asia. The Helots were called in only in cases of grave danger. As before, Mantinea Again, the Helots were called in only in cases of grave danger. As before, Mantinea. The king still held the command, but came more and more under the control of the ephors. The later held the real power and went on occasion so far as to displace the kings from command. The troops were not yet on a paid basis, excepting the helots and mercenaries, but the kings and their staff or suite were victualling. But to the close of the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans were sparing of their rewards and retained the severity of their punishments, such as death and loss of honor, while some criminals were clad and treated like slaves and had half their head and beard shaven, and burial was refused to cowards. After the Peloponnesian War, discipline declined, and the state was often forced to resort to largesses to encourage the troops to those exertions they had been in the habit of yielding as of course. The citizens still formed the body of the hoplites. Each of the 5 classes put on foot one or more mores, or regiments of 500 to 1,000 men. Each hoplite had one or more soiloi under his control, and often several helots or servants. The Laconians, freedmen, and sometimes the helots served as light troops. These became more and more numerous. At Plataea, they outnumbered the citizens 7 to 1. The cavalry remained poor. Citizens disqualified from service in the heavy foot entered the cavalry, which was used mostly for sconce and patrols. Okay, right, and the top of the page, of course, before those past 2 paragraphs is Spartan horse. So I'll just pick up from the top of that again. The cavalry remained poor. Citizens disqualified from service in the heavy foot entered the cavalry, which was used mostly for sconce. Oh, right, this looks like a misprint here. It's a U, but it's crossed over. So that would be scouts and patrols. Using the cavalry mainly for scouts and patrols. Scouts should read scouts. It reads, there's a printing error there. Agesilaus somewhat increased its number and efficiency. 1 mora, or isle, from Scirus and vicinity, where horses were abundant, was of markedly better character, and was not infrequently used in battle, where it more than once decided the day. And there was a body of 300 hippias selected by the ephors, who were a cavalry corps d'élite. The horse now rode in 4 ranks, a great improvement over the former 8. The Spartan foot stood in from 8 to 12 ranks. The maneuvers were performed in cadenced stepped to the sound of fifes, and though very simple, were excellently devised. But by neglecting the arts and sciences, the Spartans remained stationary and did nothing toward improving the art of war in a theoretical sense. They could not look beyond courage and the details of tactics. They still employed the maneuvers enumerated in a former chapter. But the wedge pincers and such other tactical movements were useful rather on the drill ground than on the battlefield. Title: Strategoi. Subheading: Athens. Athens, after Marathon, which rebounded to her greatest honor, rose rapidly in power, and the tendency towards democracy brought about many changes. Citizens from 20 to 40 were still subject to military duty, but were permitted to procure substitutes. And the author did another nice contour drawing of a Greek army leader. Alright, there we go. The list of citizens freed from military duty grew large. Aliens, freedmen, and even slaves gradually crept into the ranks, the latter mostly in the fleet. Auxiliary troops from allied or tributary nations and mercenaries increased in proportion to the citizen soldiers. The forces of Athens were large, especially at sea, and during the height of her power, the conduct of her leading citizens and the troops was uniformly patriotic and brilliant. 10 strategoi commanded the forces, one for each tribe, phyle, in brackets, and were selected by lot or vote. At the expiration of a year, they laid down their command and rendered an account of their doings to the people. They were often re-elected. Phocion served many successive terms. Such men as Themistocles and Aristides were constantly re-elected. If the people were not satisfied, and in brackets, and the Athenians were singularly ungrateful and unreasonable, end of brackets, the strategos was mulcted in a fine, failing payment of which he and his children after him were cast into and kept in prison. The proper men were often not the ones who were chosen strategoi. The ever-shifting command and the natural disagreements between the leaders frequently prevented Athens from securing the results of otherwise good management. Recognizing this difficulty, it was finally decreed that most of the strategoi should remain in Athens to attend to the victualling of the troops and the general business management, while one of the archons, in brackets, Polemarch, should accompany the army and keep up communication between the strategoi at the rear and front, and preside at the council of war. And the title above at the top of the page is called Rewards and Punishments. Right? That would certainly include the last paragraph read. The Polemarch had also specific military duties and commanded a wing of the army, usually the rights. Sometimes on occasions of great danger, the most celebrated general or citizen was chosen commander-in-chief with extraordinary powers. Alcibiades was thus honored. Under the 10 strategoi were 10 taxiarchs, who were a sort of aide-de-camp, but with specific duties and command. The taxiarchs looked after victual, camps, the order of march, weapons, and so forth. Each strategos also had one or more heralds. Rewards and punishments were practically the same as with other states. Those who avoided military duty by false pretexts were dressed in women's clothes and exhibited in public. Cowards were excluded from religious ceremonials and conventions of the people. Culprits were forbidden to marry. Even their families joined in disgracing them, and they were subjected to cuffs and insults in public, which they might not resent. The Athenians, owing to their greater luxuries, were the first in Greece whose army fell into slackness and weak discipline. The Athenian army consisted of 10 chiliarchies, in brackets, or regiments, one for every tribe, of 1,000 or more men, each commanded by a chiliarch or colonel, and under him captains and file leaders. Each hoplite had a servant or arms-bearer who retired to the rear in action. Of cavalry, there was previous to the Persian invasions a force of about 96 men, which number later grew to 1,000 or 1,200, about one-tenth the foot, and was divided into two hipparchias, again in brackets, regiments under two hipparchs, and 10 phylarchs. And here the author drew a hoplite and a cataphractos. So there is your hoplite, and there down here is your cataphractos. The richest and best fitted citizens served in the cavalry. Rigid examinations of physical strength and financial ability to support the cost of cavalry service were required. But this arm nonetheless remained very mediocre. The Athenians were seamen, not horsemen. To the Athenians belongs the credit of first making war something more than a mere physical science. The keen wit of Athens elevated all which it touched, and among the other arts war gained something of value from her brain tissue. This gain took the form of marked improvements in tactics and in the fortification and sieges, and still more of a broader intelligence in the conduct of war, and an appreciation of its intellectual character. So again, this gain took the form of marked improvements in tactics and in fortification and sieges, and still more of a broader intelligence in the conduct of war and an appreciation of its intellectual character. New page, new title. Macedon resembled Greece. In the last paragraph, a more detailed account will be found in a later chapter of the military organization of Macedon. The Greek and Macedon systems were analogous, and much of what is said of the one applies to the other. And here's a larger picture by the author of the armor of a Greek chieftain. End of chapter 6.